So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I think it's time to get started. Thank you all for coming to this webinar this morning. And I want to give a great big shout out to everyone at Elgin High School, particularly Deb Perryman, for hosting these webinars. They're just a fantastic way for all of us to come together and think about these really important global issues on our planet. So I'm going to assume everyone can hear okay and see okay and just kind of launch in. And if for some reason you can't, you can just text to me and we'll be good to go. I think we're all set. So again, thanks to everyone and good morning to everyone to think today about freshwater issues. So what I'd like to do today is, talk with you about what this, global challenge of water is about. But I'm a very solutions-oriented person. Okay, so the beginning will be a bit of a downer because the challenges are really big. I'm sure most of you know some of the big water issues in your own communities, in your own towns, in your own state. But don't get despairing about this because we're going to lift it up and show that we can actually solve these problems and that we can all be part of these solutions. Okay, so hang in there at the beginning with the down stuff and the hard stuff, and we'll be lifting it up and getting to solutions. Okay, and if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and write them. If it's an immediate thing I can answer quickly, I'll go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we'll save time for the end and we can have, sort of a Q&A, virtuous Q&A at the end of the talk. But if anything isn't clear and I can see your message, I'll try to clarify it right away. Okay? Okay, so here we go. See if I can get the slides going. Here we are. This is a shot I love to start with because it was taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts, and it showed us our own planet Earth in a very vulnerable state, right, hanging there in the darkness of space. The astronauts saw this as they were orbiting the moon. It was the very first time. This is nearly a half century ago, 1968. And the Apollo 8 astronauts sent us this beautiful picture of our planetary home, right, planet Earth. And it showed us for the first time just how lucky we are to live on this beautiful blue and white orb, right? This beautiful planet that is so rich in water. And it showed us that that is the fundamental thing that makes Earth distinct from everything else we've seen so far in the universe and beyond. And so it's that blue and white that we celebrate, this kind of gem in space. But the thing that we also know is that less than 1% of all that blue is water that's both fresh and water we can access. A lot of it's tied up in ice. A lot of it is in places we can't access for the things we need. So less than 1% of all that blue is water we can actually use, right? And is fresh and drinkable. And of course, that water is finite, right? There's only so much there. But our demands for water are not finite. Think about population growth over the centuries. Think about all the things that we do now that we didn't do 400 years ago, all the products. And so our demands for that water are growing against that finite supply of water. And everything that we use, look around the room where you are, look at your clothes, look at your chair, look at all the things in the room where you are right now, and think about it, that everything in that room took water to make, right? Sometimes a surprisingly large amount of water. Think, for example, many of us, I'm sure, are wearing a cotton shirt. I am. I'm sure many of you are. Take a guess in your mind how many gallons it might take to make one cotton shirt. And then just think about it for a second, and I'm going to show you now what the typical cotton shirt takes to make. Yeah, 700 gallons. That's a lot of water. That's more water than most of you use at home in a week, okay, to make one shirt. Most of that water is used to grow the cotton plants out in the field. Crops are very thirsty, so anything that involves a crop, anything we eat, anything we wear that's made of cotton, takes a lot of water to make, okay, a surprisingly large amount. let's think about something else. How about something I enjoy eating? It's not lunchtime yet. Hang in there. A delicious pizza. This is a margarita pizza with cheese and tomatoes and basil. Looks delicious. 330 gallons to make a pizza, right? That's a lot of water to make what most of us enjoy without even thinking about it. And don't feel guilty about this, right? It just takes a lot of water to make things. We're going to show ways we can do better, but just an awareness that everything we use and wear and buy and eat, our clothes, our jeans, our computers, everything takes water to make. Don't feel guilty about it. Just be aware that everything takes quite a bit of water to make. Now, okay, we're against that finite supply. We have to multiply all of these gallons by the billions of people we share the planet with, right? We now have 7.4 billion people on the planet. Not everybody's eating pizza and buying cotton shirts, but a lot of people are, and people have to live the way they live. Everything takes water. So multiply all those gallons out by the billions of people, and we begin to understand a little bit more about why it is we have so much depletion of water around the planet. Okay, this is a map that's showing a very simple idea, which is that as our demands grow, they're going to bump up against the limits of that finite supply in watershed after watershed, right? No matter where we live. If you live in the Western United States, take a look at that map. It's almost all red to some degree of red, right? From the Midwestern states, the high plains of Texas up to the Dakotas, all the way to California, lots of red. So anybody who's listening in from a state in the West is pretty sure that they're dealing during some part of the year or sometime with water shortage, with a scarcity, with the idea that there's just not enough there to meet all the demands that we have. And then look around the world. Asia, can you point out India? I'm not sure, I don't have a way to point to you, but I think you all know where India is, hopefully. Um, much of China, these are big countries with billions of people, right, that have a lot of water stress. Much of Asia, in fact, North Africa. So we have a lot of water stress in the world. And that shows up particularly when you have a drought, right, where you have even less rain than you're used to. California, of course, has been going through this in the last 5 or 6 years and is now coming out of it as the rains begin to fall again. But some places are in water stress most of the time, and they have to figure out how to meet those demands. And look, even down in Florida, we have a bit, even a little bit in the mid-Atlantic. So it's spreading, right? During my time, 30 years or so, working on water issues, we've seen maps like this get redder and redder with each passing year because our demands are rising. So how does this look on the ground? What do we see? We see river after river running dry. Here's the river that's closest to me. I'm in New Mexico. This is the Rio Grande. And this is not the end of the Rio Grande, it's the middle of the Rio Grande. I took this shot in August, and the river basically is completely dry because the water is diverted out of the channel to grow crops, right? It's diverted into the valley of the Rio Grande to the farmers and the ranchers that are growing crops for people, crops for animals to eat, and so the river is effectively dried up. This is the second biggest river in the Southwest. Okay, it's not a small river, so very important occurrence that's happening almost every year. Australia, different part of the world, but they have a similar problem with one of their most important rivers, the Murray, which is in the southeastern part of Australia. And how about the Colorado, right? This is the lifeline of the southwestern United States and runs dry in the last 90 to 100 miles just about every year. It takes a year of exceptional rainfall and snowpack in the Colorado Rockies to allow the river to run to the sea. This is the way it normally looks down in the lower, last 90 miles, just completely dry, desiccated. And this used to be a very rich wetland. We're going to talk a little more about that later. I've got a story to tell you about the Colorado that I think you'll be interested in. So this is what's happening. Rivers are running dry. We're seeing all kinds of problems. We also have wetlands, which are beautiful, beautiful places for birds and wildlife. And we're talking a lot during these webinars about biodiversity. Wetlands sustain all kinds of incredible diverse biological life, fish and frogs and salamanders and of course water birds and just a rich variety, but up to 50% of all the world's wetlands have now disappeared. Those habitats are gone, okay? And then we have all these species at risk as a result of having lost their habitats. Freshwater species of all kinds, fish, mussels. Mussels are really important. They cleanse our water. We're going to talk a little more about that in a few minutes. So freshwater species of all kinds are sort of disappearing because their habitats are disappearing. Here's my colleague Zeb Hogan. He's a guy that studies what we call megafish. They're really, really big fish that swim in the rivers around the world. He's got in his hands a female Mississippi paddlefish, and he's tagging them and tracking them to try to understand, how they're doing in the Mississippi River Basin. This particular paddlefish he caught in the Missouri River, which runs into the Mississippi down around St. Louis. And so this is, his passion is to, try to study these big megafish and understand what it is that's making them disappear from our rivers. So this is happening over and over, and it helps us to step back and say, okay, why is this happening? Why are these species that in some cases have extraordinary lives themselves? They've been around, in the case of paddlefish, for hundreds of millions of years. Some of them go back to the dinosaurs. And all of a sudden now in the last century or so, they're disappearing. So what has happened? What has changed? And a lot of things have changed, but the big ones I'm going to talk about real quickly. I see a question I'm going to answer real quickly. One student wants to know why the land cracks the way I did. I think it was an earlier photo. And it's because the land basically dries out. The desiccation of the land means that the moisture leaves the soil and it dries out. Here in New Mexico in the wintertime, my skin sometimes starts to crack a little bit because it's so dry that the moisture leaves our skin. I'm sure you've had this experience sometimes. And the same thing happens with the land. It gets dried out and begins to crack. And so that's why you saw that in the photo. So back to our question about how this is happening, why these things are happening. And it's a couple of important things. One is that as our population has grown and we've wanted to live in places like Las Vegas and Los Angeles, drier places that don't have as much water, we've had to build a lot of dams. And dams serve very important purposes for us. They generate electricity. We get hydropower from dams. We irrigate crops with water that's stored behind dams. We supply our cities, right, with drinking water from dams that are storing water. We control floods with dams. We build a big dam. A big reservoir behind it captures the floodwater. We might have heard recently about the Oroville Dam in California that was spilling floodwater. And then recreation, right? We enjoy being on lakes to boat and swim and that kind of thing. So this is, the picture you're looking at is one of the biggest reservoirs and dams in the world. It is the biggest reservoir in the United States. It's called Lake Mead. The dam is Hoover Dam. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's on the Colorado River. And it was the first big super dam that was built in the world. And after we showed that this could be done, countries around the world started building big dams too. And so you can see the numbers there. In 1950, I wasn't even born yet, we had 5,000 big dams. Today, we have more than 50,000 big dams. So if you do the math, That means we've been building 2 big dams every day around the world for a half century. 2 big dams a day. So think about that from the perspective of a fish. You know, if you're trying to move up a river because it's time for you to lay your eggs to spawn and create new baby fish, if you're trying to move upstream and all of a sudden you're confronted with this big structure that you can't get past, a big dam, well, you might not be able to lay your eggs because you have to have the right habitat to do that. And so that has meant that a lot of fish can't find the right places to reproduce. So the population declines. And stories like that affect all of aquatic life. Mussels and fish and salamanders and frogs. Everybody has specific habitats they need. And a dam and the way it changes the flow of the river changes all that habitat, as well as presenting a big barrier to fish, right, to get upstream. It also changes the way the river flows. You have a lake instead of flowing water. And you lose the floods, you lose the pattern of flow that so many species depend upon. So this is a big reason. Again, we built these dams for very important purposes, all those things we just mentioned. But it creates a big problem for life within the river and the health of the river. The second thing we've done is divert water from one place to another. I mentioned Las Vegas and Los Angeles as 2 examples, Phoenix, Tucson. Many cities rely on water that's imported from someplace else because they don't have enough rainfall locally to meet all of their water needs, all of their drinking water and water demands. So this is an example of California's approach, which is to bring water from Northern California to Southern California through this California aqueduct, which you see right here. Hundreds of miles the water is brought from Northern California, where it rains a lot more, down to Los Angeles and San Diego, so that those cities could grow also. That's a very good solution to a problem, but again, it has an impact on the rivers and the life within the rivers. Okay, around the world, we're taking about 10 Colorado rivers worth of water every year and moving it to a new place. So we're doing this all around the world to meet these growing water demands. I hope that makes sense to everybody. And the last thing I want to mention is we're also pumping a lot of water from underground. You know, we literally have sort of an out of sight, out of mind crisis, if you will, in groundwater. Right beneath our feet, most of us are living in places where there's water stored in what we call aquifers underground. It's kind of like a reservoir on the surface, except it's underground, and the water is stored in little pores of formations we call aquifers. And so as we've gotten the technology to do this, we've been able to drill wells into the earth and pump water out. And it has allowed us to expand our crop production, to grow more crops in dry places, to meet our drinking water needs by tapping water from beneath the earth in addition to rivers and lakes above on the surface above the earth. And so we've been doing this to a large extent. This is a picture from Kansas taken from the air, and it shows these circles that I'm sure some of you have seen if you've ever flown across the country. And these are from sprinklers, big, gigantic sprinklers. I'm going to show you a picture of one later, that basically irrigate crops by pulling water from deep under the earth and then watering those crops. But it's depleting the groundwater. We're pumping so much water out that in effect we're taking some water that people in the future are going to need, right, and using it today. It's not what we call sustainable. We're pumping more water out than nature is putting back in. And so those groundwater supplies are shrinking. So these are the big challenges: rivers, lakes, groundwater. We're depleting a lot of that supply, right, to meet our current needs. So what do we do about this? This is kind of the downer part of our story today. What do we do about this? How do we solve this? How do we make sure that when we have kids and grandkids that they have water too, that we're not using it all up? Now, let me say something. Water doesn't disappear, right? All the water on Earth is part of a big cycle that goes from one place to another over time, over space. But what does change is where the water is when we need it. If we pump all the groundwater out from the Central Valley of California, well, we're not going to be able to grow crops in the Central Valley of California, which supplies most of us with fruits and vegetables throughout the year. So it makes a difference where we're doing this and how we're doing this, and making sure that we're replenishing the water that we pump out. So what do we need to do to solve these challenges? The first thing we need to do is to shrink our personal and societal wide water footprint. The amount of water that we use every day to meet our own needs, right? We have to figure out in a way how to live healthy, happy lives while consuming less water. This doesn't mean depriving ourselves of happiness. It means how can we do what we want to do and live the lives we want to live, but consume less water in the process. Okay? And if you think about it, there are lots of ways we can do this. Most of us together today, most of us are average Americans, right? And if we're an average American, it takes about 2,000 gallons of water a day to keep our lifestyles afloat. That's a big number. Think about it. Maybe 100 of those gallons we use at home. Okay? Most of those gallons are used, about half to sustain our diets. Remember, we talked a little while ago about how much water it takes to grow crops. About a third of our water footprint is in our energy use. It takes water to cool the power plants that give us energy, that kind of thing. So, and it takes about 13 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of gasoline. Okay? All the products we use, our jeans, our clothes, we talked about this a little while ago. And then our use of water at home, showering, cooking, watering our lawn in the backyard. So all of that takes water every day, about 2,000 gallons a day if we're an average American. Okay? So there's lots of ways we could think about saving water in our own daily life. The next thing we need to do is think about how we do this together as a society, on our farms, in our factories, at home as families, right? How do we do this? And so we're beginning to have these conversations as a society about how we can shrink our footprint together so that we can live the lives we want and need to live, but require less water to do that. Okay? And I'm going to come back to some examples of that real soon. So what's the second thing we need to do? We need to not only shrink our footprint, but then we need to figure out how to restore some water to the natural environment. How do we go from those dry rivers to wet rivers again? How do we get rivers flowing again? So if we're going to have a healthy society, both of those things are important, shrinking our footprint and returning some water to the natural world for the fish and the birds, for recreation, for the things we enjoy, as well as to support other species on the planet with us. And so this is what I've spent a lot of my life working on, is how do we do this as a society, as a world? And about 5 years ago, I was working with National Geographic. I was heading up their freshwater program at National Geographic. And I began to feel we were doing some great education. We had built, and I should mention this to you guys, we have a really interesting tool online called a water calculator, a water footprint calculator that you can use. You can go and walk through your daily life and see how much water it takes for you to sustain your life. It'll ask you questions about the kind of foods you eat and the kind of energy you use at home and the kind of things you enjoy shopping for and things like that. And you can see what your number is. And it's kind of a fun educational thing to do. But I was, feeling really good about the tools we had built, like the calculator. We had a really great website. But I felt like I wanted to do something meaningful on the ground. How do we make a difference on the ground with this National Geographic program? And so I called up a very interesting man named Todd Reeve. He was a freshwater biologist, but he had a real sense of business about him. And I had never met him, but I'd heard about some things he had created and done that might allow this to happen. And so we basically framed out a national initiative, if you will, to basically do those two things we need to do: shrink our footprint and return water to the natural world. And it came to be called Change the Course. And it works in a very simple way. And again, I'll show you later how we can all be part of this. Basically, we ask people in the public to make a pledge to conserve, to think about their water footprint, and think about something they feel they could do every day to shrink their water footprint. Could be taking a shorter shower, could be maybe changing their diet if they want to, could be deciding instead of buying a new shirt, I'm going to trade my shirt with a friend and get something new without having to spend another 700 gallons for a new cotton shirt. And you could do a lot of creative ways of things about thinking through how to shrink your footprint. So this is a voluntary pledge to conserve, right? Then our corporate sponsors fund restoration projects. So in a sense, they're taking care of your pledge. They're saying, let me back up a second. We promise that for every pledge that's made, we will restore 1,000 gallons of water to a depleted river or wetland, or replenish an aquifer. 1,000 gallons for every pledge. What makes that possible are sponsors of Change the Course that underwrite those pledges, right? They fund projects that we identify with conservation groups to be ecologically good for rivers, scientifically they're good, and they need additional funding to happen. So we take your pledges and promise 1,000 gallons for every one, and restore, with conservation groups, restore that water to rivers and wetlands on the ground. And so it's kind of taking public education and conservation and restoration and making this big circle about it and saying every time we conserve, we're going to restore. And it's been a fantastic program. It's been a highlight of my life. And here's what we have so far. More than nearly 250,000 people have made the pledge to conserve with us. We have about 30 businesses of all kinds and sizes that are sponsoring Change the Course, partnering with us to raise awareness about freshwater issues. And we've funded more than 30 projects across North America, right now 10 states as well as Mexico. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what some of these projects look like to get you familiar with some real problems and solutions on the ground, but also to give you a sense of the kind of difference we can make together, right, if we decide to work on this kind of a solution together. So let me give you 3 of my favorite stories. They're very quick. They won't be long, but they'll give you a sense of what's happening. I was just in this river system last week, and I've been there a couple of times before that. This is a river called the Verde River in Arizona that is a tributary, which means it flows into the Colorado River. And it is one of the most important rivers left in the American Southwest for fish and birds and wildlife. You know, as I mentioned, so many rivers are dried up. The beautiful forest, what we call the riparian habitat on the sides of the rivers, has been altered and changed and degraded. But in this case, there's still quite a bit of it left. And yet, because of irrigation diversions, again, irrigators are just doing what they do. They need water to grow crops. In this case, they were taking most of the flow of the river out of the river during the summertime in order to grow crops in the valley of the Verde. And so the river would be dry for 5, 6, 7, 8 miles sometimes. And so we partnered with the Nature Conservancy of Arizona to do something different. We basically helped install this automated head gate on the ditch system that the irrigators use, that the farmers use to divert the river. And it basically allows them, for the first time, to take just the water they need from the river, rather than the whole flow, and then leave the rest of that water for the river. So they get the water they need for their irrigation, for their crops, but the river gets water too, and it doesn't dry up anymore. And so this has been done on a number of rivers in the Verde Valley, and so the Verde River is flowing better again. Last week, we stopped in to visit this farmer, Zach Hauser, who has gone a step beyond that and has put in drip irrigation on his farm. Drip irrigation is one of the most efficient ways farmers can irrigate. I'm sure you've seen some of this in backyard gardens where you've got a little tube that has holes in it and it delivers water directly to the roots of the plant. So you don't lose water to evaporation or seepage down. You basically give the plant just the water that it needs and you deliver it very efficiently. This machine that Zach is standing with helps him to move the drip lines from row to row on his farm. And he's growing things like pumpkins and corn, sweet corn in the summer and for summertime and so on. So he's saving water that's going to keep more flow in the Verde River. And so these are really important projects that show we can have just as much food as we did before, but use less water to produce it. And that's exactly the kind of thing that's going to help rivers. So everybody, this is another shot of the Verde. So everybody who relies on the Verde in some way, the Verde River, benefits from projects like this. The irrigators have a more modern irrigation system with that automated head gate. The birds and wildlife have better habitat because the river's flowing. Businesses, local businesses now have more people coming to boat and fish and enjoy the river, recreate around the river. And the community benefits from having a beautiful, healthy, flowing river. So these are the kinds of projects we love that show you can have just as much production from the water as you did before, just as much crops are being produced. It is smart. I agree with you. Somebody just wrote, this is so smart. And it is so smart. And we can do this over and over again. The river and everybody benefits. Another quick example. I wanted to have an example from a different part of the country. And this is in southwestern Georgia. This is a beautiful river called the Flint River, which flows from northern Georgia all the way down to southern Georgia. It joins another river called the Chattahoochee, and then flows down through Florida out to an important bay in Florida. So it's a very important river system. The Chattahoochee and the Flint join the Apalachicola, in case anybody's in Florida, and then flows out to the Apalachicola Bay, which is where a lot of blue oysters and important fisheries come from. This is a picture I took in the summer. I was there in, when was it? I think it was August this year, because I wanted to see, and this is another Change the Course project, what the irrigators are doing with researchers to figure out how they can use less water. And you wouldn't think you'd need to save water in Georgia, where it rains quite a bit. But in fact, same kind of story was happening, where irrigation was pumping a lot of groundwater, which depleted the flow of the rivers. This gets a little complicated, but groundwater and rivers are often very connected. In the summertime, particularly when rivers are flowing low, groundwater that seeps into the channel keeps that river flowing. And if you don't have that groundwater, the river may either dry up or flow very low. And that's bad again for the fish and the mussels and everything. And so that's what was happening here. And if anyone's listening and they're from the southeastern part of the United States, you probably know that you're living in one of the most biologically diverse places from a freshwater perspective of any place in the country. The diversity of fish and mussels is off the charts. And so we're very concerned about making sure the habitats in this region are healthy, right? So remember those circles I showed you earlier from the air in Kansas, those big circles that were created by sprinklers? This is the kind of sprinkler creating that circle. It's called a center pivot, and they can be very, very large. And these were literally rolled into southwestern Georgia in the 1970s and began to pump groundwater very much, more and more groundwater, and the river flows began to be affected. Okay, this is actually me talking with a researcher from the University of Georgia, who we're going to talk about in just a second. And so scientists went out, these are scientists surveying freshwater mussels in a creek called Spring Creek, which is a very important tributary to the Flint River. And that has an abundance of freshwater mussels, but they're declining and they're disappearing because of those loss of flows and other changes to their habitat. So the mussels, this is just a shot of scientists basically surveying to count the mussels and understand how many there are there. They're finding that they're declining. But again, solutions are starting to appear. And this is one of the projects that Change the Course has decided to partner on. The two gentlemen on the left side of the screen are researchers with the University of Georgia, and they have been working on using information technology and soil sensor technology to help irrigators know just how much water crops need in given parts of their field. And so it's basically taking efficiency technologies, making the delivery of water more efficient by putting in some additional technology on the sprinklers, but also bringing our computerization in, bringing in information technology to basically map the field and say information technology to basically map the field and say, wow, the soil there is drier than it is there. We need to irrigate more there than there. And there, we don't need to irrigate at all because it's too rocky to go grow crops. And so it allows you to create kind of a map of the field that tells a farmer just how much needs to be irrigated. But the farmer doesn't have to worry about it because that information goes right into a computerized, head system there at the sprinkler. It goes right into that box that Casey Cox is standing at on the right, and it's programmed. And so when you turn on the sprinkler knows, oh, I'm going to shut off here. It has a GPS system that allows the sprinkler to know where it is, and it's going to deliver just the water that's needed to the crops at any point in the field. I hope that makes sense. And so if you're shutting the irrigation system off for 10% of the field, you're automatically saving 10% of the water. And in agriculture, 10% is a lot of water. So it's again a way of getting smarter about how we manage water. And it means that the irrigators are going to still be able to grow just as much as they did before, but use less water. And that's the holy grail, right? And so, whoops, I'm sorry. And so this is still very much sort of an experiment. It hasn't moved out real broadly yet, but we're hoping that this will make a difference in places like southwestern Georgia where you can introduce these technologies. Okay, one last story, and this is one that's really close to my heart. And some of you may have heard about it because it was in the media quite a bit a couple of years ago, and it continues today. The Colorado River, as I'm sure most of you know, is sort of America's river. You know, it carved the Grand Canyon. It is a lifeline in the American Southwest for all kinds of cities. We grow so many crops in the Colorado River Basin. And yet it runs dry for those last 90 to 100 miles, as I mentioned before. And that area is called the Colorado Delta. Well, a couple of years back, I guess it was actually in 2012, 5 years ago, the United States and Mexico signed an agreement. This is the first time this has ever been done. Two countries signed an agreement to give some water back to the river, to the Delta. It did a number of other things important to both Mexico and the United States, but from conservationists and environmentalists, the big thing was we're going to work together to give some water back to the Colorado Delta. And so in 2014, for the first time ever, we lifted the gates at this dam, which is called Morelos Dam. It's the very last dam on the Colorado River. It's right at the border of the US and Mexico. And this was the first time that we decided to give some water back to the Delta, okay? This is maybe a little hard to see, but if you think about to the left of that of the dam, or what would be sort of up on the slide, that's sort of the U.S. side, and then the part of the slide closest to us is in Mexico. And so the gates were lifted, and the river began to flow. Now remember, it was dry, so the whole area downstream from here is now dry. But the gates are up, the river is starting to flow. And so what happened was the upper part of the channel began to get water. This is me in a canoe with a couple of Mexican conservationists. The gentleman in the second canoe in the back is a world-renowned ornithologist. He studies birds. He's a wonderful conservationist named Osvel Hinojosa Huerta. So I had the pleasure of canoeing with them to understand, how the birds are beginning to really come back to the delta, even as the water has just begun to flow. Every morning, my National Geographic colleagues and I would go out and look for the leading edge of the river. Remember, the delta is about 90 miles long. It's going to take a while for the water that's been released from that dam to flow downstream. So we would get up early in the morning and go out and think, where's the river going to be this morning? And we would look for the leading edge. And this is the leading edge on a particular morning. A number of conservationists are already out there. I'm there with my notebook and the blue shirt taking notes. And it was just an extraordinary experience to watch this river come home, come back to its channel. We would stand one day in a place like you see on the left, and then 2 or 3 days later, we'd go back and it would look like the picture on the right, a place you'd want to have a picnic, a place that is really beautiful and not desiccated anymore. So it was just an extraordinary experience to watch this come back. One of the most amazing things for me was to watch how the community responded to the river coming home. They welcomed it. These kids were probably, what do you think, maybe some of you, I'm sure, around the same age. They look to me maybe, what, 10, 11, 12, maybe a little younger in some cases. But they had never seen the river that had given their town part of its name. They had never seen the Rio Colorado. And here they were playing in it. This was about a week after the gates opened at the dam. And they were celebrating and playing and just having a great time. We went back on a Sunday afternoon and there were hundreds, probably maybe 1,000 or more people picnicking and barbecuing and playing and boating and just having a wonderful time. So the community just welcomed the river back in all kinds of ways. And then 8 weeks later, after the lifting of the gates, the river made it back to the sea. And this was the extraordinary thing that made the headlines and everybody wrote about and the media covered. The Colorado had rarely reached the sea during the last half century, and here a little bit of the river was once again reaching the sea. And if you think about the destiny of a river, right? If you're a river, what is your destiny? It's to reach the sea. You want to flow to the sea. You have a job to do. You're bringing sediment. You're bringing nutrients. You're replenishing the delta, which is so rich for wildlife and birds, and then the fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico, which you see the upper part of in that slide. The river and the sea connection is very important for the ecosystem as a whole. So the river connected to the sea, and this was just an extraordinary event. And today, the restoration of the Colorado continues. What's happening now are some what we call base flows, which are sort of sustaining flows that you deliver to habitats that have arisen or that you've created in the delta for the birds and wildlife. Remember, the delta used to be this lush, beautiful place, right, until it got desiccated from the lack of water. So now we're actively releasing water, as you can see here, into these restoration areas. Some of this water is leased from farmers who don't need so much water or are willing to share their irrigation water for conservation purposes. And so we're working with this Colorado River Delta Water Trust to lease water, purchase water rights that farmers no longer need or want, and return that water to nature for the benefit of fish and wildlife and birds. And so here's an example of what some of the habitats look like that are being created in the Delta. And picture birds that are migrating, right, all the way from South America up to the Arctic. They don't have any place to stop and rest and feed and nest unless there are habitats in places like the Delta. As I mentioned, so many of the wetlands are gone. So we're starting to bring some of these habitats back through active projects like this. So we've been thrilled to play a part in this historic restoration, right, of the Colorado Delta. So those are 3 examples of of projects, and we have, as I say, more than 30 projects that are going on through Change the Course. We always partner with a conservation organization on the ground, and I always am, grateful that so much hard work is going on the ground to make these projects possible. So what do? We can all be part of this. We can fix this, is the important message. Conservation and restoration together can do a lot of good in the world in terms of making our freshwater use more sustainable. So here's a few examples. If after school today or over the weekend, you want to think about what would you want to do in your life to shrink your footprint? What could you imagine doing that wouldn't, in any way deprive you or make you less happy, but you could imagine doing it and enjoying being part of this solution? It could be anything, like we have a few examples there. Think about all the water that is in that food. Well, what about not wasting so much food? What about, if we're at a buffet or at home, taking only the amount of food we know we can eat so that we don't have to throw any food away? That saves a lot of water. And every time, in the morning, I enjoy a cup of coffee. If I pour a cup of coffee and don't finish drinking it, and I dump that coffee down the drain, that's 34 gallons of water going down the drain. What if I didn't make more coffee than I'm going to drink, or take more coffee than I'm going to drink and save the rest? So there's a lot of ways, and that has no change in my enjoyment of my morning coffee. I'm just not wasting any. So with our diet, there's just not wasting food can save an enormous amount of water. Thinking about our energy use, right? Remembering to turn off the lights. It takes water to create electricity. So when we think about energy a lot, but think about the water it takes to make the energy. We can think about not watering our lawns quite as much. You'd have to talk to your parents about that. Do we really need to water all the time? A lot of cities are focused on helping people understand how much they really need to water. And here in the West where I live, planting landscape plants that don't require so much water as green grass does can save a lot at home. So these are just a few examples. Buying fewer clothes. Do we really need 25 t-shirts? I'm amazed at how many t-shirts I have in my closet and in my drawer. So lots of creative things we can do, each of which saves water. So think about it and think of one way you can do it. And if you make a pledge, here's what you can do. If any of you do social media of any kind, we have a hashtag. You can hashtag change the course, and let us know what you're doing. Let us know what kind of a voluntary pledge you've decided to make. And we'll be able to see that pledge on social media. Again, the hashtag is hashtag change the course. And we'll be able then to say 1,000 gallons goes back to a depleted ecosystem on your behalf for making that pledge. So does that make sense to everybody? I hope that's been clear. I wanted to, make sure that you understood what we're doing and why, and how important this freshwater challenge is, how we can all be part of the solution if we want to be. And really, in a sense, working together, we can change the course of our water story for the better. The human story is a water story, and we can make it a better story by working together. So I'm going to leave it there and look for your questions now. Okay, I'm going to put on some glasses so I can see what you've had to say. We've got about 10 or 12 minutes for questions, which is great. I love questions. So don't hesitate, okay? Okay, so here's a question. Let me see. I'm going to go back a little bit. Let me take the one I can see right here, which is, I'm going to go back here and put this out for a minute so you can see that while I'm talking. Okay, Mrs. S., my fourth graders would like to know your college path to your very cool job. That's a great question. I'll be very brief about it because I know we have other questions, but I had a very, very interesting path. I went to a very small liberal arts college in Ohio called Wittenberg University. And it's a great liberal arts school. And I just have to say, I just 2 weeks ago had the incredible honor of being invited by the president to come give the commencement address at this year's graduation. So I'll be going back to my alma mater and giving the commencement address this year. I'm just thrilled about it. But what I got there was a very broad liberal arts education with teachers who really gave us a lot of attention. And I had a geology professor. I had no intention of majoring in geology, but I had a geology professor who just got me hooked on wanting to know more about the earth and wanting to study the earth. But he also recognized that I love to write and I love to communicate. And so he encouraged me to get a fellowship right after college that would bring my science and my writing together, which it did. And I went on to graduate school at Duke University and studied ecology and environmental management and environmental science. And it just all came together. And my first job got me hooked on fresh water, and I never looked back. The freshwater bug bit me, and I just never let go. So I was very, very lucky to have great teachers, great professors. The teachers you have in high school, thank them. You're going to look back years later and realize, oh, they made such a difference for me. Even if you don't see it right now, you'll see it later. And be grateful, because I'm incredibly grateful for the professors and teachers that I've had in my life. So that was sort of my path. I've been on a mission with freshwater my whole life, and I've been very grateful for every opportunity and every person that shaped that path for me. Um, wow. My sixth grade class wants to know how much a drip irrigation machine would cost. So drip irrigation, that machine that I showed you in the slide, was just used to basically take the drip lines out of the soil so they could be moved someplace else. There was another machine that put the drip lines into the soil. So you had one to take them out and one to put them in. And then you've got the drip equipment themselves, right? You have the drip lines and all the machinery that goes into operating it. So it can be quite expensive. But again, if you're saving water, often it can pay for itself. Again, it depends on how much you have to pay for the water and what it's costing to pump the water. In this case, that particular machine, as I recall, I have it in my notes right over there, but I don't want to take time to look at them. But it was maybe $17,000, something like that. I'm not positive, but I think it was somewhere in that ballpark. Kelly would like to know what inspired this project and how do we plan to make this global? Very good question. We piloted Change the Course in the Colorado River Basin, from the headwaters in the Rockies all the way down to the Delta in Mexico. And that showed us that it's working. And then we began expanding to California and to Georgia. And now we're thinking about New England. And so we're looking for areas where the right opportunities exist. So we're a small team, we're a very small group, but we would absolutely love to expand this globally. And I'm hoping that what might happen is conservation organizations in other countries will see this model and realize they can make it their own. You can do this in Spain, you could do this in Canada, you could do this in other parts of Mexico, Central America, over in the Middle East. It could work anywhere, and we don't have to necessarily take it there. The model can be adopted and adapted for those cultures and those geographies. And so it's a way we hope it might just spark others to do something very similar in their own part of the world. So here's another question. A few days ago, let's see. Sorry, I just lost it. There's a question about desalination, and I thought that would be an important one to answer. Wow, we have a lot of great questions. Oh, I'm looking for the desalination question. Okay, I'm going to go down again. Okay, here's another question. As far as clothes, do you know, does it take more water to make clothes with natural fibers like cotton or wool, or more to produce synthetics like polyester? This is a great question. Also for food, I read somewhere that it takes more water to grow wheat than corn. Is that true? So, very good question. As with everything, it depends how you produce the fiber, right? So if you're producing cotton with drip irrigation, it's going to take less water than if you flood the field. So that 700 gallons I showed you is an average number. You can produce cotton for a lot less if you're drip irrigating the cotton plant. Okay, you might reduce water use by 50% that way. And a lot of cotton is grown with drip irrigation. My guess is that in most cases, producing synthetics would be less water intensive, like a polyester would take less water than cotton. But again, think about the whole life cycle. Synthetics might take more fossil fuel, more oil. So you have to factor in the water that it takes to produce the oil. So it gets complicated to compare. It depends on the type of irrigation, the type of synthetic. And I'm not giving a very specific answer because I don't always know which is going to come out higher or lower on water. But my guess is the synthetic would take less water, but I'm not positive about that. And again, it's going to depend on how the, 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 the cotton is irrigated. As for the next question, growing wheat than corn, corn generally takes more water than wheat does. And wheat grows at a different time of year. Corn tends to be grown more in the hotter summer months where you have more evaporation. Much wheat is grown during the winter time when you have less evaporation and more natural rain. So, but corn's water footprint tends to be a bit higher than wheat in general, but again, depends on how you irrigate it, if you irrigate it, okay? Okay, let me scroll down. I don't know about the Mobile Tensas Delta, making that into a national park. Somebody was asking if I knew about that project, and I'm sorry I haven't heard of that, but I think I'll look into it now that you've brought it to my attention. I'm going to scroll down a little more. Here's the desalination question. A few days ago, I did some research on this topic. Some experts said that it was possible to desalinate water to make it fresh water. Do you think that is an appropriate solution? It's a great question, and it's a very important question because more and more cities are looking at taking water from the ocean and removing the salts and turning it into drinking water. And this is a very, very viable technology, right? We have many cities around the world. I believe there are now over 18,000 desalination plants around the world's coastlines that are taking seawater and turning it into fresh water. Here's the problem with it. It takes a lot of energy to do it. Most of these plants have what we call a reverse osmosis membrane. It's a membrane where you push the salt water through, and the membrane leaves the salts behind and gives you fresh water on the other side. But it takes a lot of energy, okay, to do that process. And so in a sense, what you're doing, especially if your energy source is a coal plant or an oil-fired plant, you're basically putting more fossil fuels into the air, which is changing our climate in order to produce more drinking water. And that to me is not necessarily the best solution because part of the reason you're building the desalination plant is to give you water supply in the case of drought. That's why San Diego has just built a plant, is to make sure that they can have drinking water during a time of drought. But if you're putting more climate change gases into the air, you're going to increase the likelihood of drought. So it's kind of a vicious circle. It's not the best solution. And what we talk about is that if we look at conservation as a serious alternative to desalination, you'll find that there's a lot of ways you can conserve water that is much cheaper, more environmentally good, less environmental harm, I should say, than desalination. Okay, and less than 1% of all the water on Earth less than 1% of all the water we use around the world comes from desalination. Okay, it's a very tiny share of the solution right now, but in certain places it's important. The Middle East does most of the desalination because they just don't have rivers. They don't have a lot of rain. So Israel, the Persian Gulf countries, the United Arab Emirates and those countries in the Persian Gulf, they rely a lot on desalination. Island nations that don't have another good source. So it has an important place in our water supply, desalination, and we're seeing more and more of it. But what we'd like to suggest is before you jump to building a desalination plant that requires so much energy and is quite expensive, think about conservation. And some cities have decided they can avoid desalination by doing conservation. And that's really kind of the trade-off. And so we encourage to look at those solutions in a very broad way. I think we're actually running out of time. I just see I hit 10 o'clock. I'm sorry if I took too long to answer some of those. You all had such great, did you calculate my water footprint? Yes, I did. Um, oh, it's pretty good, but I could do better. Mine might have been something like 1,300 a day or something like that. I don't eat a lot of meat. That helps a little bit. I do eat some meat, but not as much as the average American, so that helps and brought my footprint down a little bit. But I live in a dry place, so I irrigate, native plants even need some water. Um, anyway, thank you guys so much. This has been a delightful morning for me. Change the course. Would love to have you as a pledger. So just think about fresh water and let's work together to do what we can to keep it healthy. Thank you so much. You all have a good day and a good afternoon and a good weekend. Take care now. Bye.